Welcome to What a Word is Worth, space for creative minds to speak about viable ways to heal the world through writing and other inventive mediums. This is your host, Marianela Medrano. I am the founder of Palabra Training Center, where words are given as medicine. And today I have a very special guest, Anthony Peterson. Before I even introduce my guest, I just want to take a moment to reflect and keep in our hearts the brothers and sisters of countries that are at war right now, and Ukraine specifically, given the development of the latest day and even today with more killings there. So just taking a moment to hold that in our hearts. So as I say, my guest today, Anthony Peterson, has studied, taught, and written about cultural and racial realities for more than 30 years. I discovered him through one of his Tedtalks and was so impressed by his words that I conquered my shyness and contacted him. My gesture was met with utmost kindness and openness, and here he is today with us. Since 2004, Anthony has designed and facilitated diversity workshops in corporate, academic, and community settings. Anthony's diversity discussions took a personal turn in 2014 when he began documenting conversations with his white grandchildren regarding race. He hopes that those conversations serve as an invitation for others to tell their own racial stories. With degrees in psychology and religious education, Anthony formerly served as an adjunct instructor in ethics, cultural worldviews, and biblical studies at Tribeca Nazarene University. He also has extensive experience in the realm of editing and publishing, and is a contributor to the blog Rhetoric, Race, and Religion. Anthony is an Army brat who calls Hawaii home, but he continues work as an educator, writer, and editor in Nashville, Tennessee, where he lives with his wife of over 2 decades, Laura. They have 4 grown children and 11 grandchildren, maybe more. Welcome, Anthony. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for this invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here. Thrilled to have this conversation with you. We have 12 grandchildren and 1 great grandchild.
Wow.
So, and we are honored and privileged to live near all of them. So we get to see them whenever we want to.
That's so awesome.
Yeah.
So as a man of words, when did you first realize the power of language to open doors? And will you say words heal too?
Certainly words can heal. Obviously words can also hurt and bring great harm. And I distinguish between hurt and harm because sometimes words hurt on their way to healing, but sometimes words are harmful, which is a different kind of hurt. And when I mean hurt on the way to healing, sometimes we have to say hard things to people in order for us to move forward. And so we might feel that hurt, but that's not necessarily harm. It's not really harming the person. to answer your first question, I don't know, there have been times, stages in my life or moments in my life when I've reflected on the power of words. But in terms of actually realizing the power of words, it probably started very early in my life. My parents are word people. My father was a stickler for grammar and just speaking in ways that communicate. And so I kind of came by some of those issues naturally. I did well in English classes, language classes. And so I've just sort of through the years seen the power of words. And moving into like college years, I began to speak and not just write. I began to speak more in public places because I recognized the power of positive words for healing, for growth, for overall well-being, the potential at least for that.
Yeah. And, I want to pick up on what you said about the important, how important conversations sometimes are very hard to have. And I'm thinking, I don't know if you're familiar with Mindfulness of Race, is a book written by Ruth King.
I have heard of her and I've heard of that book. And so now I have to go out and get that book because you're at least the second person who has raised that for me.
So there is one thing that she highlights in that book, and it's, in Buddhism, we work a lot with the hindrances, the 5 hindrances. And she talks about the hindrance of intent and impact.
Oh.
And how we might have good intent, but have a terrible impact. Yes. So the focus, according to her, is on impact more than the intent. And, as I say this, I'm also reminded of another book that I use quite a bit in my work, and that is My Grandmother's Hands, Resmaa Menakem. And I don't know if you're familiar with that book. He talks about, clean pain and dirty pain.
Oh, okay.
Right? So, so what I'm saying this, I'm bringing this up to agree with you, how words can heal and can also hurt, and that we have to be vigilant, we have to be careful, as I think you are. I mean, as I said at the beginning, I was so impressed by your care for words and how you deliver such an important message without hurting.
Yeah.
So
well, no matter how much care we take, we still hurt with our words sometimes. And it comes back to that intent versus impact issue. When we talk, when I'm giving diversity, inclusion, and equity training, that whole issue of impact versus intent is a whole segment of our training, pretty much all the time. And what we talk about is, what if you say something that has hurt someone and you didn't intend to hurt that person? Then how do you address it? And one of the first ways to address it is to focus on the impact rather than the intent. And what I like to say is intent does matter. It's not that intent doesn't matter. It does matter, but it's not the most important thing that matters. The most important thing is the impact your words had on someone else, and particularly if it was a harmful impact. And if we want to grow as people, we want to be better human beings, then when someone confronts us with our harmful words, then the first thing we should do is take a breath And then the second thing we should do is listen for the impact and not jump to our defensive stance of that was not my intent. And there might even be a chance to say that was not my intent, but it's not the first thing you say. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing was the impact.
Care, yeah, to send the intention, the awareness, the mindfulness to the impact. Yeah. You know, and you have spoken and written quite eloquently about how your intent is not to fuel the divide among people, that you want to inform, to provoke thought, to begin to change narratives, right? Mm-hmm. And my colleague and sister, Dr. Maureen Walker, who was a guest speaker here, says in her book, When Getting Along Is Not Enough, she says that race sits like a cipher in the midst of relationships, right? Mm-hmm. So having, and you have also addressed this, like the conversation about race is difficult. It's one of those difficult conversations that we must have. So my question though for you, is there a particular narrative that you think will alleviate the current suffering due to racialized trauma that we're having?
I think, this is not something I've thought a lot about, but as you ask the question, much of what I encourage is telling our own stories and listening to one another's stories. And too often, especially in the United States, when we talk about race, the whole idea gets quickly politicized and quickly polarized. So it's all this either or. Either you're a racist or you're not a racist, either you're black or white, which is, obviously we're not all black or white, and some of us are black and white. But we like to talk in those polarizing types of ways. But once we get to telling our stories, then the political elements change. I'm not saying there's no political element, but we're not taking sides on an issue. Your story is your story. My story is my story. And there's no right or wrong about my story or your story. There's no this side or that side. We're not against one another. Our story is our story. And it's so rich, so much richer than right or wrong, so much richer than this side or that side. And I think when we begin to tell our stories, and for many of us, especially when it comes to race, for many of us, we haven't even thought about the racial stories. And I think especially about people who are called white. Many have not thought about what it means to be white. And so one of my goals is to encourage folks who are called white to think about whiteness, think about what it means to be white, and what is your story with race. Some of them will say, I don't have a story. Well, no, you do have a story. So I want to encourage folks to get in touch with that story. And I think that helps the conversation, that helps the healthiness of the conversation, and that helps us move one another forward in these areas.
Yeah, and kind of enrich the narrative, right? Because it is so true. I mean, we are defined by, science defines us by our DNA, right? And then society defines us by the color of our skin. And we both know that race is a social construct, it's an invention.
Right.
Yet, as you have pointed out in various of your talks and your writing, race matters. Mm-hmm. So can you say more about that?
Well,
why does it matter?
Yeah, well, first of all, when you say race is an invention, it's a continual invention. Because just talking about the United States context, the line for whiteness, the category of whiteness has actually grown from when it was first introduced in the United States. Example, Irish folks, Italian folks, Jewish folks were not considered white in ways that they are now. So that category has changed through the decades, through the years, through the centuries. But we can know scientifically that that race does not exist. But we don't live just in a scientific world. We live in a social world. We live in a cultural world. We live in a relational world. And so because we put these labels on people, that it matters. I was watching, my wife and I were watching a food show. This guy who goes around the world and visits different places around the world and samples their cuisine. And the episode we watched yesterday was set in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil. And to look at, it reminded me that the categories of race in Brazil are very different from the categories of race in the US. The categories of race in South Africa are very different from the categories of race in Brazil or the US or Australia. I mean, all those categories are different. And that tells us that it's not something that is real, you know, that is universally real. But when you visit any of these places, race plays a part in each of those places in different ways. You know, the race categories in South Africa definitely matter. They absolutely matter, just as they matter here in the US, in North America, or in Brazil.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's in Latin America, it is such a complex issue, right? Because we have what an author whose name I'm not gonna remember, I just came upon her book, but she was talking about this innocence of race that we claim, which is that, you know, if you talk to a Latin American person, they will say to you, oh, we're not racist, we are all mixed people. But then if you go into the reality, and Brazil is a very good example, and so is my country of origin, the Dominican Republic, where colorism has caused so much trauma. And yet we still continue, you know, we think we're cute when we say, you know, I'm not a racist, I come from, you know, we are all one. It is not true. You know, in my country, the Dominican Republic, if in order for you to apply for a job, you are required to attach a picture of yourself.
Oh.
Why do you think that is?
Why? Why?
We want to see how you look.
Right. How is that a qualification for the job?
Exactly.
You know, how you look. How is that a qualification for the job?
Right. And so that's the thing. If we look at the social stratifications in Latin America, the power, the resources are in white hands, right? So if you are a white Dominican, and if you happen to be a white male Dominican, which is another thing, you have wider access. We have a handful of names that own the island, but that's, don't get me going there.
Okay.
Let's come back to what you were saying, the importance of having these conversations, right? And as someone who has offered DEIA trainings throughout so many years, you know that, yes, there are many dimensions of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, but you have, you also know that the focus on race, on color, is paramount and will trickle down into the other domains. Wouldn't you agree that?
Well, I would, either race is paramount or it's second to gender. Because gender is also very, I mean, I'm thinking about the backlash that President Biden, and I'm not wanting to be political, but when President Biden said that he was going to nominate an African American woman to the Supreme Court, and this backlash of why are you considering her gender and her race, when we look at 115 Supreme Court justices in the history of this country, 108 of them have been white males. 108 of the 115. So in some way, for more than two centuries, there was a hidden qualification for being a Supreme Court justice, and sometimes not hidden, sometimes spoken, qualification for being a Supreme Court justice, and that was be a white male. If you're not a white male, don't even consider applying. So this is how we know that these things matter. And this is how something that seems maybe racist, like saying, I'm going to nominate an African-American woman, that sounds racist to some people, but it's really just a corrective to what's been going on for more than 2 centuries.
Exactly.
I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Well, I think so, and let's keep going in this direction. How social conditioning. We are conditioned, right? Socialized beings, and that needs our constant attention. It's like a baby, you cannot leave unattended. And what are your thoughts as someone who has also paid a great deal of attention to the rhetoric of religion? Let's talk about compassion and the coming together that it requires to have this conversation. And one of the things, I'm throwing a lot at you right now with this question, but I know you'll help me here. I think about what we do when we facilitate these affinity groups that are so popular these days. And what I'm saying is, to me, affinity groups make a lot of sense because there is a need for that kind of protecting and facilitating and creating safe space, so that then we can come out and participate at a wider scale and come together and sit in with a wider community. So when you do your work, how much emphasis do you put in creating affinity groups?
We work, I work in these areas on my own, but I also work with some consulting agencies, and one in particular here in Nashville. And that organization does a lot of work with affinity groups in businesses, employee resource groups in businesses. I haven't done a lot of that work, but I have some thoughts about that work, and I agree with you in the value of having people feeling a safe place, say in the workplace, and with like-minded people or like ethnic people or like gender people. There is that value. But when we talk about those kinds of groups, we talk about further value for the company beyond the feeling of belonging for the people in the affinity groups, because another value of those is, well, two other values of those affinity groups that we can think of. One is that when people feel like they belong in a workplace because of something like affinity groups, then they want to contribute more to the company. They want to be there. They want to participate. And part of what they contribute is those values that come specifically out of that affinity group. What are those values that group can bring to the overall organization that might have been missing from that organization? So that's the second value. And then the third value is when you cultivate those sorts of groups, other people outside of the organization might begin to know about those groups and might begin to look at your organization as someplace that is welcoming, that is open, that is, and so it becomes I mean, I don't mean to be crass about affinity groups, but it becomes a marketing tool. It can become a marketing tool for that organization, because people are looking for, when they're looking for jobs, more and more they're looking for a place that they believe is going to be diverse and inclusive. And so when companies invest in something like ERGs, employee resource groups, or affinity groups, it makes them look good, beyond the actual good that it does.
Yeah, and Anthony, I'm thinking right before, when I was waiting for you, I was reading Mindful of Race. And I highlighted these that I'm gonna share with you because I think it speaks directly to what you were saying. She says about this inclusion by hiring or inviting people of color into leadership and project roles. So she says, while this act has good intent, this is going back to the idea of intent and impact, it often falls short of acknowledging differences and considering what will ensure an inclusive and welcoming culture. And then she goes on to talk about, tokenism. So she said, without such consideration, people of color are tokenized. Mm-hmm. The institutions appear to be diverse when it is actually only window dressing diversity.
Right.
So it's a complex thing, right?
Obviously, yes, it is. It is complex, and that's why I said I didn't want to be crass about the sort of the marketing part of affinity groups in the workplace, because it can be false marketing. We like to say you can't hire your way into diversity, and by that we mean, yes, you can hire more people that are more ethnically diverse or diverse in many other ways. But if you haven't already created a culture of inclusion, then you're really not helping at all. One, you're not likely to maintain that person, to retain that person in the workplace. If they don't feel that they belong, then they're going to be looking for someplace else to go. But also just the culture in general needs to have that sense of inclusion, or not only will you lose folks and have to hire new folks, but also you lose the value of that diversity.
Mm-hmm. So going back to the issue of creating new narratives, then will you say it's like, I guess the attention is both on, is there a different narrative that you want to change from the companies, and then a different narrative that you want to change from the employees? When you think about, when you go into a cultural setting that you want to impact?
Well, I think there is both. So a lot of times the work that we do, when especially with this consulting agency, and I guess I can say their name, and they're called People 3, and based here in Nashville. But not only with People 3, but in other, I know other organizations do this same sort of thing. We tend to begin with the person who invited us to do this DEI work with them. But then one of our first goals is to get whoever the executive committee is, the CEO, the COO, whoever's in leadership, we try to get them on board with the values and the value of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And we train them first, usually. Now, we might listen to employees across the country, across the company. I mean, we might, because we often have listening sessions to find out what are your feelings about inclusion. Do you feel like you belong here? And in what ways do you feel that? In what ways do you not feel that? So we have that segment. But in terms of moving forward, we like to start at whoever is on the top leadership, and then whoever reports to them. And then we do a more general training for all of the employees. But one of the things we say to all of the employees is everyone is responsible for a culture of inclusion. So even though we have this value of training, and the reason for training the people at the top is, if you're just training other employees, that can get derailed very quickly if you don't have buy-in from the CEO or the COO or CFO, whoever those people are. If they're not bought in to the values, the importance of diversity, of inclusion, of equity, then it gets derailed very quickly.
I agree. Beginning from top bottom, right? Influencing those who are in the position of changing. And the other thing that I'm thinking, and I also in the work that I do, I think a lot about this, and it's the concept of the fatigue that Black and people of color, we are dragging with us, and that we have to be careful not to add to that. And at the same time, we want people to not lose the ability to have the difficult conversations that you were speaking about before. Right. So it requires, I think, the work that you and other people like you and like myself, the work that we are doing out there in the world requires, again, what I said is this 24/7 vigilance. Like, it's like we have this baby that we cannot leave unattended. We have to be cognizant, right?
Right. And you and I have chosen this work. But there are people who look like you and I, who look like you and me, who have not chosen this work. And the fatigue is probably greater with them, because I measure what I can do and what I can't do. And I'm doing this work because it's important to me, because I think I have a voice, because I want to hear other people's voices, and I've chosen this as work that I do. But it's very easy for people to look at people who look like us and think that they have the same capacity, emotional capacity, as you and I do, because we've chosen this.
Yeah, I never thought of that. I mean, in the way that you are saying, it's such a rich and there's so much work to do. I always think about the landscape of our memory is quite. I don't want to say polluted, but I do want to say polluted by the scenes of historical trauma. That has been, the angle that I have chosen in both my research and even my writing, both as a poet and as a nonfiction writer. It is complex and it requires. It's going to keep us busy, don't you think? For a long time.
Yeah.
I bet you're not thinking about retiring anytime soon.
No, I'm not retiring anytime soon. But when I in dealing with these sorts of issues, I don't see how retirement works. I don't. I imagine that retirement's not the end. My death is the end, and these issues will persist beyond my life. I know they will persist beyond my life, but I want my life to be worth something, and this is a way. This is a way for me to give back. And also be enriched by the diversity of everyone I come in contact with.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I can't imagine retirement from this kind of conversation.
As you look back at the 30 years of work, what is the most satisfying shift in narrative that you have witnessed? That you feel like, yes, I'm so glad I lived through to see that?
That is a very good question. And I'm trying to answer it, and I'm trying to answer it in a way that's truthful, but it might come out a little bit, I don't know, self-serving or even corny or something. I think about my white grandchildren, and of those 12 grandchildren and the one great grandchild, 11 of those people are considered white, and right now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them are in school, are in kindergarten through 12th grade. All 6 of them are in schools as white people in which they are in the minority, and in fact, the significant minority. And so I see how they operate in their schools and with their friends, and I am thrilled with the ethnic diversity in their schools and how the teachers and administrators and students navigate that diversity. That's probably the most encouraging development I've seen in a long time. And it's simple. I mean, it's just reality, because here in Nashville, all the schools are not diverse. Most of the public schools are ethnically diverse. In fact, most of the public schools have minority of people who are called white in most of our public schools. Our private schools are different. They would have a majority of folks who are called white. And so that's a distinctiveness about schools here in this area. But all of my grandkids are in public schools. So So they're in the minority, and I just see how they, navigate their space, and it's encouraging to me.
Yes, and that speak to how important it is to, I mean, your stories about the work that you do with them, the questions that you pose to first your children and now the grandchildren. It's a good testament, though, of how we have to start small and we have to start at home
Yes.
in order for us to branch out
Right.
to the larger scale.
And one of the challenges for people who are called white is they might be, and I'm not painting with the broad brush, but they might be reluctant to even discuss race and ethnicity at home. And so part of what I try to do is to provide those stories and that example of how you can do this simply at home. How it doesn't have to be a major conversation. It can be a simple conversation and then another simple conversation, so that talking in these ways becomes natural and not something scary for parents. Because it's scarier for parents than it is for children.
Right. But if we don't have those conversations, we might fall into the innocence, kind of like
blind color blindness.
Exactly.
And all of that. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm so glad people like you and Laura exist in the world, and that you are doing the work at home, and that in your case, I don't know what Laura does, but that you are out there, changing cultures and creating a culture of appreciation across the board, but also paying attention at the home base.
Yeah. And I can see, I mean, I'm very happy with the schools my grandchildren are in, because they are cultivating that culture in their schools. They're cultivating without having to, without the tokenism, I guess, without that putting people in a box. They just create a culture that is a belonging culture, that is an inclusive culture in their settings.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah.
So let's switch a little bit. I recently, as I prepared myself for our conversation, I discovered your association with Barack Obama, who I think is in my view, a very important figure for America, and especially in the gender, if we go back to the conversation on gender, I think Barack Obama really embodies healthy masculinity. We have been, what's happening right now in Ukraine is a byproduct of toxic masculinity, and what has happened throughout the history in this country, the unfortunate events that we have witnessed have mostly come from toxic masculinity or decisions that are informed by that. So I discovered that you had an association with Barack Obama, and you spoke so fondly of the young Barack that you knew. Has there been any contact with him in the last few years? And
there really hasn't. He came to speak here before he was president, when he was running for senator, for U.S. Senator from Illinois, and he came here to Nashville to support another candidate for senator from here in Tennessee. And so he came and he spoke, and I went up, and I was in that crowd. And then afterwards, I walked through a line and actually shook his hand and gave him my business card. But I don't look the same as I did. Well, there would have been, what, a 30-year difference since I was in high school at that time. And so I don't look the same. And we haven't had any direct contact in all those years. But I did shake his hand. I don't know if he would remember that, but you know,
he didn't recognize you at all.
no, I don't think,
know.
you know, he's going through a line of shaking various people's hands.
Right.
I used to have a giant afro when I was in high school, and I don't wear that anymore. And, you know, I was a middle-aged man at that time. So no, he wouldn't have made that connection. And I don't know, when I gave him the card, he put it in his pocket. I don't know who empties his pockets, or, you know, I don't know anything like that. But I want to get back to your assessment of him as an example of healthy masculinity. You know, that's nothing I have explicitly thought of before in terms of him, but I do agree with you. And, you know, his successor gives us that contrast, you know, the great contrasts between healthy and not healthy. But I, you know, my affection for Barack Obama as president was not just because I knew him, although that's a part of it. I knew him. We were both from Hawaii. We were both Black men from Hawaii. We were both Black men who went to school at the same school for 1 year. And then we had our actual connection. We played basketball together. We went and ate lunch together. I wasn't, neither one of us were in the, he wasn't in my core group of friends, and I wasn't in his core group of friends. But we did meet with one other guy about once a week, just the three of us, to talk about life. And so when I first heard him on the public stage, which was at the 2004 Democratic Convention, when he gave the keynote speech, and he talked about, well, two things that stood out to me, where he talked about, you know, this is not a Democratic America or a Republican America. It's the United States of America. We're not blue states and red states. We're the United States of America. So he said that, but then he also said, and this just, well, he said, we need to eradicate the slander that says that a Black youth with a book is acting white. And he said that, I jumped out of my chair, because that's the kind of conversations we used to have in high school. Because the three of us African Americans at that school, and that year I think there were 5 African American boys at that school and no girls, out of 1,600 students. But the three of us got together, and one of the things we talked about is how all of our lives, because we were academically minded people, all of our lives we were told that we were acting white because we were academically minded. So when he said that nationally at the Democratic Convention, I thought, that's our conversation. But yes, and so, you know, I have a lot of pride in him as a campaigner, as a president. You know, I didn't agree with every decision he made, but his character, and now I'm going to think more about his masculinity and the example he set for us in that arena.
Yeah, is there something I have not asked that you want the audience to know in closing? Or is there a special message that you want to share other than the wonderful sharings you've already done here?
Well, I want to go back to, you mentioned compassion, and I don't know if you had a chance to watch my second TED Talk, but I talk about empathy, which
Yes.
we've
Yes.
heard a lot about these
Mhm.
in the last few years.
Mhm.
I talk about curiosity and I talk about humility.
Yeah.
And I think those three things go together. Honestly, I think humility is the most important one. And because I think lack of humility is what keeps us from connecting with one another.
Mhm.
If we think that the way we operate in the world and the way we think in the world, if we believe that that's the only right way, then we're not going to be very good relationally. We're not going to help the social order. We're not going to help our healthy culture. We have to be humble, and all that means is recognizing that the way I walk through the world is I am the only one who walks through the world the way I walk through the world. No one else on the planet sees the world in exactly the same way that I do. And that's then when the curiosity comes in, is I can be curious about your background, your feelings, where you're coming from. And that helps us to have that empathy. But I think it has to start with humility. Sometimes empathy or compassion can deteriorate into pity. And I said that in that second TED Talk. And I'm not talking about pity. We're talking about just humbly walking through the world and with curiosity about our fellow human beings. I think those are the keys to a healthier culture and a healthier society.
I so much agree, and I I feel so bad that we have to end here because I'm feeling like, oh my God, this is where the conversation is really getting to be interesting in terms of, yes, this both curiosity and humility. As the way I see it, they are the platform in which empathy can then blossom. You must come back, Anthony. We must talk more. But in the meantime, I do invite our audience to look at to watch your TED Talks, and especially, yes, the second one. I mean, they're all your talks are so full of wisdom and compassion. Yeah, that comes across, even though, as you said at the beginning, we all have the potential to hurt with our words. But I think you have developed the quality of being able to distill your, very close to poetry. That's what we do with poetry. We distilled words in a way that they become so intentionally. And I want to thank you for that. And thank you for your generosity, for answering, a call from a stranger, and for being the wonderful person you are. And
thank you for this conversation. It's been enjoyable for me, and I would love to come back.
Yes, great. So thank you for listening to What a Word is Worth. You can access today's interview at Anchor, YouTube, and other platforms. And if you are interested, hit the subscribe button in your podcast app. And also, if you find this program beneficial, leave us a review. I am with you in love and compassion.